Today we're going to learn about the compound sliding miter saw. We're going to break the discussion into three main sections: inspect, setup, and use of the miter saw. But first, let's get to know the tool. In our class, we work with the DeWalt DW718. The specific purpose of miter saws is to cross-cut stock to finish lengths and to make miter and bevel cuts. Let's look at some of the parts. Most importantly, we have a safety guard, then we have the handle, power switch, fence, table, miter gauge, miter lock, and slide rails. Now let's get into the inspection, setup, and use of our saw. On the inspection, one of the first things you want to check for on a power tool is the cord itself. I like to slide my hands along the cord because it's easier to feel a defect than it is to see one. In addition to checking the cord length, we also need to check the end of the cord to see if it's supposed to have a ground prong and if the prong is in fact installed. You can see this plug does not need or does not have a ground prong, nor does it have a hole where one is missing, so this is a good cord. Next thing we like to do is check the blade. Believe it or not, a sharp blade is more safe than a dull blade. When we have a dull blade, we have a tendency to push harder to get it through the stock, and that can be dangerous. When checking the blade, you want to check to make sure that the teeth are there and that they appear to be sharp. Look for obvious signs of heat, which is also a sign of being dull. Check that the blade turns straight. Now, if I'm going to be touching the blade of this tool with my bare hands, I'm going to make darn sure that it's not plugged in, which is why I hold the cord in my hand so I can be sure that it's not powered up when I'm inspecting the blade. Another big thing we want to check is the proper operation of the safety guard. The guard should move easily up and down as the saw is used. And then finally, we want to do just an overall inspection of the tool itself. Now, you may not know the tool in and out, but you can tell usually if it's been dropped off a truck, dropped as it's being brought out of the classroom, so give it a good overall inspection. The second category we deal with is the setup of the saw. Now, I don't mean specifically setting up to make the cut. We'll talk about that next in the use section. I'm talking more about, let's just talk about setting up the stand. It should be on flat, stable surface. Now, setting it on a construction site is perfectly fine as long as the saw itself has the legs locked and it's not wobbly. Finally, using the tool. Before we use any power tool, we want to make sure we have the proper PPE on. And we also want to check ourselves before we wreck ourselves. As they say in The Incredibles, no capes. Check yourself for hangy-dangly items. Hair should be tied back. Do you have a hooded sweatshirt on? Are there strings hanging down? Tuck them in. How about necklaces? How about lanyards with keys? No hangy-danglies, no capes. As we're going through the setup and use of the saw, we want to make sure we're never putting our fingers over the trigger. Our fingers should be straight, using the palm of our hand to push the tool up and down as we make alignments and other checks. Never put your finger over the trigger. It's a bad habit to be in. Only put your finger over the trigger when you're ready to actually make the cut. You want to keep your hands out of the circle of death. For the most part, when we're at a 90-degree angle or at 0 on the miter gauge, the circle itself is 6 inches, and that keeps us back a safe distance. Now, sometimes when we angle the miter side to side, we'll have to adjust our finger distance accordingly, but for the most part, on a straight cut, if you keep your hands out of this circle, you'll be back 6 inches. Do not stand in front of the blade when you make a cut. Stand off to one side or the other, and do not cross your arms. Hold the stock tight to the fence and flat to the table. It is a miter saw and it can make very precise cuts, but only if you hold the wood stock properly. When we go to actually make our cut, one of the first things we want to do is a dry run. With our fingers straight, we want to bring the blade down to the wood and align. Here I'm detailing what's called the kerf of the blade. You have to realize the blade itself is about 1/8 of an inch thick. When that blade comes down, it will literally turn part of this board into sawdust. And if you do not have the blade aligned correctly, you're going to cut off some of what you wanted to keep. So here I'm trying to make an 11-inch cut, but the kerf of the blade is directly centered over the alignment arrow on my board. That's going to miscut it. Instead, I need to move that blade just to the, in this case, to the side, the left of my arrow, so that I maintain the entire cut. Let's look at that again. Wrong position, centered over the arrow. Correct position, off to one side, maintaining the entire length. Now we're finally ready to put our finger over the trigger, power the blade, and push it all the way through the wood stock. Don't force the blade, let the blade do the work. Bring it all the way through the wood, release the trigger, and let the arm return back to the up position. There you have it. We've talked about the inspection, setup, and use of the DeWalt compound sliding miter saw.